The night was thick and biting when Leonard Kessler settled into the worn leather armchair of his Boston apartment, surrounded by shadows and forgotten papers. The lamp's light flickered over the cluttered table of old notes, a reliquary of the past he futilely tried to leave behind. The silence of the early morning was interrupted by the metallic sound of the building's gate closing, and soon after, a gentle knock on the door. Surprised, he hesitated before opening. On the other side, the hallway was empty. Only a brown envelope lay on the floor, its surface creased by anxious fingerprints. Picking it up, a shiver ran down his spine. Kessler had the instincts of a man who had spent decades dealing with secrets, and as he tore open the side of the envelope, he felt as if he were being pulled back into a world he thought he had left behind. Inside, a single name was stamped on the age sheet: Elara Soren. Below it, a black and white photo of a woman with delicate features, gray eyes, and an impenetrable expression. But what truly froze Kessler's blood was the date printed next to it, 1985. The woman in the photo could not be alive, and if she were, she should not look exactly the same as 40 years ago. The dossier contained more than just a simple photograph. As Kessler leafed through the pages, fragments of a NASA report emerged, written in cold, bureaucratic language, describing the crew of the Odyssey 9 mission. He remembered that name. Everyone remembered. The missing mission, swallowed by deep space without a trace, an event that had become just another tragic story in the annals of space exploration. But there, before his eyes, were reports from 1997, 2004, and even 2018. They all mentioned Elara Soren, always with the same photo, no signs of aging. At the bottom of the last document, one more piece of information: Fairhaven, New England. He read and reread it, searching for meaning in the impossible. If this woman really existed, then everything he knew about the mission was wrong. A surge of anxiety tightened his chest. He knew well the consequences of asking the wrong questions about the wrong secrets, but something stronger than caution was pushing him: the insatiable need to know the truth. The coastal road stretched out like a tunnel of darkness and fog as Kessler drove north. Passing through small, sleepy towns, he found himself immersed in uncomfortable memories. There was a time when his name meant something in academic and investigative circles, before his involvement in classified cases turned him into a disposable man. That was precisely why the dossier bothered him so much. Whoever sent it knew he couldn't ignore it. Fairhaven appeared on the horizon like a forgotten specter, its Victorian houses marked by time and the sea air, its streets silent under the heavy mist that seemed to whisper secrets to the wind. He parked near what seemed to be the town center, a place that once had some importance, but now was just a scene of closed shops and empty bars. Before getting out of the car, he looked again at the photo. Elara's face stared back at him as if challenging his perception of reality. Following a ghost made no sense, but he didn't believe in coincidences. His first stop was the town archives. The building was small but well preserved, with an elderly receptionist who barely glanced at him as she handed him the request forms. Kessler combed through microfilm, residency records, and voter lists, hoping to find something that disproved what he already suspected. But no. Elara Soren appeared in the records from 1990 onward, always with the same address, always with the same data. A name with no previous history, a woman with no past. The weight of the discovery was stifling. How was it possible that no one noticed? How could someone live so long without raising suspicion? Stranger yet, there was no mention of jobs, relatives, or any digital footprint. It was as if she were an invisible presence, merely existing, without interacting with the world around her. When Kessler left the archive, the sun was already disappearing on the horizon, bathing Fairhaven in a melancholic golden tone. His next destination was the registered address, a modest house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a small neglected garden and encircled by trees bending in the ocean breeze. He stopped on the sidewalk, observing the dark windows. For a moment he hesitated. There was no certainty about what he expected to find there. But something inside him, something primal and uncontrollable, pushed him forward. He walked up to the door and knocked twice. The sound echoed in the silent night. No answer, only the wind howling through the trees. Before he could decide whether to persist, a slight movement on the side of the house caught his attention. A figure was slowly moving away along the narrow path leading to the nearby woods. Kessler reacted instinctively, following without hesitation. The trail was narrow, winding between twisted branches and fallen leaves. He heard the footsteps ahead stop for a brief moment, as if the person knew they were being followed. When he finally emerged from the woods into a clearing, he saw her. The woman was there, standing under the pale moonlight, her hair blown by the wind. It was her, exactly as in the photo, exactly as in 1985. Her gaze fell on him with an unsettling calm, as if she had been expecting his arrival. Leonard felt a deep chill run down his spine. Nothing about her indicated fear or surprise. She didn't look like a fugitive, nor a cornered woman. Instead, her look carried something different, a silent acknowledgement, as if they both shared a secret he still didn't understand. He opened his mouth to speak, but all he managed to say was her name, almost like a question. She remained silent for a long moment before slightly inclining her head and replying, her voice low, almost a whisper. Elara Soren. There was no doubt. There was no escaping the truth. Whatever was happening, whatever she was, shouldn't be possible. Kessler's breathing was heavy as he stared at the woman standing before him. The biting wind shook the tree branches around them, but Elara didn't seem to feel the cold. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of serenity and meticulous observation. He tried to find the right words, but they all seemed inadequate in the face of the impossible. You disappeared in 1985. What happened to Odyssey 9? The question sounded more like a statement, an acknowledgement that what he was seeing made no sense. Elara did not react immediately. Her gaze was profound, calculated, as if she were weighing every word before deciding what to say. Finally, her voice came softly, unhurried. You're looking for something you might not want to find. The answer made Kessler's blood boil. It wasn't what he wanted to hear. For years, he had clung to what was left of his credibility, trying to understand the cases the government buried. Now, facing the only clue that could fill in the blanks, he had no patience for riddles. He stepped forward, but Elara remained still. I need answers. You shouldn't exist. No one survived that mission. You were there, but you shouldn't be here. His tone was harsher than he intended, but all he got in return was silence. Then something changed. Elara's gaze briefly shifted, not to him, but to their surroundings. Kessler realized too late. A strange noise broke the night's silence, a dry crack of leaves and branches snapping. They weren't alone. In an instant, Elara stepped back, her muscles tense. You were followed. Her voice expressed no surprise, only certainty. Kessler spun around instinctively, his eyes scanning the darkness of the woods. Years of paranoia kicked in immediately. He knew this kind of feeling. When you spend too much time close to the truth, someone is always watching. His survival instinct made him act before he could think. He grabbed Elara's arm, pulling her with him into the woods. Visibility was poor, but darkness was their ally. Footsteps sounded behind them. There weren't many, but enough to set him on alert. He didn't know who they were, and he didn't need to. If they were there, it wasn't to talk. Elara did not resist, moving with an almost inhuman precision across the uneven ground. Kessler felt her pulling on his arm, and in a move that surprised him, she pushed him against the trunk of a tree, hiding him in the shadow. Don't move. The order was delivered in such a cold tone that there was no room for questioning. He held his breath. Silence. Only the wind dancing through the branches, muffling the subtle sounds of approaching footsteps. A silhouette appeared among the trees, a dark figure moving cautiously. Kessler couldn't see the face, but he recognized the bearing of someone trained, not a civilian. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched the stranger pause, looking around. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, dancing among the trunks. The man was holding something at his waist. A weapon? Elara didn't move, didn't blink. The stranger remained there for a few more seconds that felt like an eternity, then turned on his heels and headed in the opposite direction. Silence once again dominated the space. Kessler only breathed again when he was sure they were alone. When he turned to Elara, he found her eyes fixed on him. I warned you. Her voice carried no irritation, just a fact. He felt the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, but something inside him was beginning to change. That woman, that creature, knew exactly from whom they were running. The tension of the moment turned into a need for answers. Kessler moved away from the tree, his nerves still on edge. Who were they? How did they know I'd be here? Elara looked away for an instant as if weighing how much she should tell him. They always knew. You're not the only one trying to understand what happened 40 years ago. But the difference is they don't want the truth. They want silence. Kessler felt a bitter taste in his mouth. It was always like this. People like him were disposable, pieces of a bigger game in which they never knew all the rules. But now he wasn't willing to back down. He wanted to understand. He needed to. You were there. You came back. What happened on Odyssey 9? Elara took a deep breath, her expression revealing something close to weariness. Then, for the first time, she spoke directly. I didn't come back. I was left behind. The confession hung in the air like an impossible sentence. Kessler felt its impact in his chest. What does that mean? But before she could answer, a distant sound cut through the night. The ignition of an engine, tires spinning on dirt. The men pursuing them were leaving, or worse, preparing for something bigger. We need to get out of here. Elara's voice carried a restrained urgency. Kessler nodded, sensing that for the first time in years, his life was being swept into a secret much bigger than he could imagine. He followed Elara through a path that cut across the forest, his thoughts swirling. If she was telling the truth, it meant she wasn't there by accident. She hadn't survived the mission. She had been left behind, and that meant someone, or something, could be coming for her. When they finally emerged onto an empty road, Elara stopped and looked directly at him. You want answers? Then you need to understand there's no going back. If you come with me, you'll be hunted. Kessler already knew that. The cold ocean wind swept across the deserted road, and in the distance the faint lights of Fairhaven flickered. Something inside him told him this was the moment to decide. But deep down, he already knew the answer. It was too late to turn back now. Elara watched him for another instant before resuming her stride. Without hesitation, Kessler followed her. The cold of the early morning intensified as Elara and Kessler advanced down the deserted road, their dark silhouettes outlined by the moon's pale light. The silence between them was dense, full of unspoken questions and postponed answers. Every step Kessler took echoed in his mind like a reminder that he was crossing a line of no return. He had always known his obsession with the truth would lead him to dangerous places, but now he felt something different. Something whispered inside him that he was not just chasing the truth. He was following a fate that had been traced for him long before that night. Finally, when they reached a point where the road opened onto a clearing, Elara stopped and turned to him. Are you ready to listen? Her voice wasn't an invitation, but a warning. Kessler simply nodded, fists clenched in anticipation. Elara raised her eyes to the sky and began to speak. The Odyssey 9 mission was never meant to come home. They sent us into the unknown with no guarantees, no safety. Officially, our mission was to test new technologies for long-distance travel, but the truth was different. We were sent to look for something, or to confirm that something was already out there. Kessler felt a chill run through him. The government knew something. They were seeking contact. She continued. For months, we orbited Europa, monitoring inexplicable signals. In an instant, everything changed. Something found us first. There was no time to prepare defenses, no communication. Just an overwhelming force pulling us out of orbit, dragging us to a place I can't describe. Time ceased to exist as we know it. There was no sky, no ground, only a presence. I can't explain what it was because I don't know myself. Her words hung between them like something alive, pulsing in the silence. Kessler tried to process it. Everything she said went against known laws of physics, against everything humanity understood about the cosmos. But what disturbed him was not the impossible. It was her tone. There was no emotion, no panic, just a fact, as if it were something that should never be questioned. He needed to understand. How did you come back? What happened to the rest of the crew? Elara's expression closed, her eyes carrying a shadow he couldn't decipher. I didn't come back. I was left. They chose. My body was no longer just mine. My memories were mixed with something that didn't belong to me. They looked at me and decided I couldn't stay. So they sent me back. And when I woke up, I was back on Earth, in the middle of the ocean. The ship never returned. Only me. The silence after that revelation was deafening. Kessler felt his skin crawl. If all of that was true, then Elara was not just a survivor. She was an anomaly, an error in a plan no one understood. And worse, she didn't really know what she had become. Whatever was inside her, whatever had chosen her, was not human. Kessler stepped back, trying to gather his thoughts. The government knew. They had monitored her for decades. They never touched her, never exposed her. They just watched, as if they were waiting for something to happen. His mind raced, connecting dots, trying to find patterns. Do you feel you're still connected to them? The thought slipped out before he could filter it, and for the first time, Something changed in her expression. Fear. A brief flicker of emotion that disappeared as quickly as it had come. I don't know, but sometimes I dream of them. And when I wake up, something in me is still listening. Her words echoed in Kessler's chest with an almost physical weight. It wasn't just a matter of running. It wasn't just a matter of a secret. Elara wasn't just a mystery to be solved. She was a beacon. If something had left her behind, maybe it was waiting for the right moment to return. Before he could delve deeper, a new sound broke the night. A ringing phone, not his. Elara slipped her hand inside her coat and pulled out a disposable cell phone. Kessler watched as she answered without hesitation. He could barely hear the voice on the other end, but recognized the urgent, anxious tone. When Elara hung up, her eyes were darker. "We have to go. They've found Holloway." Kessler felt a bitter taste in his mouth. Dr. Martin Holloway, the man who knew too much. The man who was afraid even to speak about what he knew. If someone had found him, it meant they were closing in. Without question, he followed Elara as they made their way along the road, taking a shortcut via a dirt trail. His heart pounded in his chest. He knew the patterns. When secrets like these start to unravel, time becomes an enemy. If Holloway was still alive, they had little time to reach him. If he wasn't, then only the ashes remained of a man who knew too much. Each step was a reminder that he was no longer a mere observer. He was part of the story now, and the world he knew was about to become something irrevocable. The horizon was turning a pale blue as night slowly yielded, but Kessler knew the real darkness was yet to come. The dirt road wound between the dark trees, the sound of Kessler's and Elara's footsteps muffled by the heavy dampness of early morning. The world around them seemed suspended between night and day, a moment of transition where everything could exist and vanish at the same time. The tension between them was palpable, unspoken but present in every hurried movement, in every wordless glance. Kessler kept his thoughts organized, trying to prepare for the worst. If Holloway was still alive, they had to find him before it was too late. If not, then they had to discover what he left behind. Elara led the way, her steps certain, guided by something Kessler couldn't decipher. There was something about her that seemed beyond time, beyond fear, as if she had already witnessed this moment before. The car appeared on the horizon, parked on the roadside, its doors ajar like either an invitation or a warning. Kessler felt adrenaline surge through his body. Nothing about it seemed right. He proceeded with caution, eyes scanning the surroundings, alert for any sign of life. Elara moved first, circling the vehicle. The driver's side window was shattered, tiny fragments glinting in the faint dawn light. On the seat lay a folder of open files, papers scattered as if someone had left in a hurry. Kessler felt a chill. This was not a getaway. It was an interruption. Elara knelt down, picking up one of the documents. The writing was dense. Diagrams and codes interspersed with scientific terms that would only make sense to someone who had read something like it before. Kessler recognized the pattern immediately. These weren't just research notes. They were a map of possibilities. The body lay a few meters from the car, partially hidden by low vegetation. Kessler saw it before Elara, but he said nothing. He approached slowly, feeling the weight of the moment before even confirming it. Holloway lay face down, his shirt stained with dried blood, a clean bullet wound through his back, a killing with no haste, no brutality, professional. Kessler knelt by the body, fingers instinctively searching for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. The death didn't shock him, but the message behind it did. Whoever had done this wasn't trying to hide it. They wanted to show they knew they were too close. Elara stood in silence for a few seconds before speaking. He knew he was marked. That's why he tried to run. Kessler breathed deeply, anger simmering beneath his skin. Then why call us? Why leave clues? Elara held up the document she was still clutching. Because he wanted us to know before they did. Kessler took the papers, studying the diagrams. They were calculations, coordinates, but what really caught his eye was a photo among the pages. An old grainy photograph of what looked like a starry sky. But they weren't stars. They were patterns, impossible formations, like a language carved into the void. Kessler looked at Elara, a knot forming in his stomach. "What is this?" Elara didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the image, her hands gripping the paper tightly. Then, quietly, she muttered something that made Kessler's stomach churn. "I've seen this before. Not through a telescope, not in a book. I saw it when they took me." The statement lingered in the air, charged with something bigger than either of them could grasp. The sound of tires sliding over gravel broke the silence, a jarring reminder that time was up. Kessler stood quickly, pulling Elara with him. The black car appeared at the bend in the road, its headlights cutting through the haze with unmistakable intent. "They found us," Kessler muttered, feeling his survival instincts surge. Elara didn't hesitate. Without a word, she spun and ran toward the woods, Kessler following closely. The sound of the car door opening, hurried footsteps on the dirt, voices muffled by headsets. It was a chase. Kessler had experienced this before, but this time was different. This time, it wasn't just his life at risk. It was something far greater. They moved quickly through the trees, dodging branches and roots that seemed to reach out to trap them. The sounds of the pursuers grew louder, heavy steps snapping dry vegetation. Kessler knew that sooner or later they'd be surrounded. They needed a way out. Then Elara stopped abruptly. Kessler nearly collided with her before realizing why. In front of them was a clearing, but it wasn't just a clearing. It was an old transmission station, its antennas corroded by time, a forgotten relic from an era when signals were sent into space without knowing if anyone would respond. Elara turned to him, her breathing measured, her eyes filled with something he still didn't understand. "We need to activate this. They used it before. We can use it now." Kessler had no time to argue. The sound of the pursuers was coming closer, and he knew they had no choice. If Elara was right, then this place was more than an abandoned station. It was a pathway, a message waiting to be sent again. The real question was what would happen when someone on the other side finally picked up. The wind swept across the clearing violently, shaking the rusty antennas as Kessler and Elara ran into the old transmission station. The pursuers were close, their steps echoing among the trees like precise hammer blows. The station was deteriorated, panels covered in moss and rust eating away at the cables that once beamed signals into space. Kessler moved fast, searching the equipment while Elara touched the wires with an unsettling air of recognition. She knew exactly what to do. "This was activated before, wasn't it?" Kessler asked, prying open a broken panel. She nodded, her eyes on the controls. "Someone tried to communicate. They weren't the ones who found us. We were the ones who called." Footsteps in the woods grew louder. Kessler knew they had little time. The equipment was old but not entirely dead. Elara began turning knobs, adjusting frequencies with a precision that seemed instinctive. He watched her fingers glide over the controls as if this weren't her first time doing it. Kessler glanced around, realizing they needed a distraction. He found a screwdriver among the debris and started unscrewing metal panels, dropping them on the floor. If they made enough noise, maybe they could confuse the trackers for long enough. Suddenly, the radio static roared to life, a deep hiss that seemed to draw something out of the silence itself. Elara froze, breath caught. "They've been listening all along," she murmured. The first shot shattered the cabin's glass, sending shards everywhere. Kessler instinctively ducked, pulling Elara down with him. The echo of the gunshot faded, replaced by the dry sound of footsteps pounding on dirt. They weren't interested in capturing them. They wanted to eliminate any trace of the transmission. Kessler knew there was no escape. If they ran, they'd be easy targets. If they stayed, they'd be executed. Elara didn't seem to think about that. Her eyes were on the transmitter, her hand twisting one last dial. Then, in the midst of the static, something changed. A sound, a different frequency, a pattern Kessler didn't recognize but that made Elara go completely still. He looked at her, noticing something he hadn't before. It wasn't just a signal, it was a response. The hunters drew closer. Kessler felt his survival instincts screaming, but something bigger kept him in place. Whatever was on the other end of that transmission wasn't human. Elara narrowed her eyes as if she were hearing something inside herself, something beyond human hearing. When she looked back at Kessler, her face bore absolute certainty. "They're coming, but not to take me." Her tone was somewhere between a revelation and a warning. The sky began to change. The clouds shifted as if something were pressing the air from inside out, an invisible vacuum shaping the space around them. Time seemed to bend. The wind went still, and for a moment, everything was suspended. The armed men hesitated. They felt the change. It was not just a terrestrial threat. It was something beyond their understanding. Kessler saw fear flash in one agent's eyes before he stepped back. They weren't ready for this. None of them were. The sound on the frequency intensified, no longer static, but a pulse, something alive, something ancient. Elara took a step forward, her breathing calm, her eyes fixed on the sky. Kessler wanted to ask what would happen now, but he knew words were no longer necessary. For a fleeting moment, he felt the meaning of it all. Odyssey 9 was never meant to return because it was never just a mission. It was an invitation, an open door, and now it was being answered. The light arrived without warning, a silver flash, without origin or source, only a presence taking over the night. The hunters fell to the ground, blinded by the intensity, while Kessler shielded his eyes with his forearm. When the light faded, the station was empty. Elara had vanished. He looked around, his heart pounding like a drum. There were no footprints, no sign of a struggle, only absolute silence, as if the world had taken a deep breath and held it. He felt the weight of that moment crushing his chest. She hadn't been taken. She had chosen to go. And he knew, deep down, it was exactly how it was meant to be. The agents, staggering, looked around in panic. They didn't understand what had happened. They wouldn't be able to explain it. Kessler watched them, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not anger, only a profound understanding that some truths were never meant to be contained. The silence in the clearing was broken by one last whisper of static, something beyond still there, something that couldn't be translated. Kessler knew, in that moment, that he would never see Elara again, but he knew that somewhere, she was still listening. What do you think really happened to Elara? What was activated in that transmission? The ending is between the lines, and your interpretation can change everything. Leave your theory in the comments and share this story with anyone else who needs to discover the truth.